Prologue, the fog of conquest. The Second Great War had raged for 2 years. The German war effort has led to a weakened Europe and whispers of a potential desire to bring the war overseas, involving the Americas. The key to German success thus far lies in a sinister and mysterious aerial bombardment technology that creates dense fog, churns the local terrain, and, in the wake of the explosion, the creation of swamps. This bombing campaign by Germany has disoriented and immobilized Allied forces, who have thus far been bogged down by the quagmire, as well as their inability to discern the origin of the underlying technology to create swamps. The German Nazi High Command strategically employed this technology, known as Nebelkrieg, or fog war, to create a formidable advantage on the battlefield. The fog not only disoriented their enemies, but also provided the perfect cover for a new horror the Germans had unleashed upon the battlefield. The Nazi High Command had commissioned their scientists to conduct a series of genetic modifications upon some of their soldiers, transforming them into reptilian hybrids. These chimeras, known as the reptiloiden, were then unleashed on the battlefield. With their enhanced strength, speed, and the ability to thrive in the treacherous fog and swamps, the reptiloiden were nigh unstoppable. The Allied soldiers that were lucky enough to survive an encounter would describe them as having seen a single reptiloiden tear through an entire platoon and still not slow down. The soldiers on the ground had only one word to describe them: rippers. As Germany continued its conquest, the reptiloiden became the vanguard of their terror campaign, spreading chaos among the rank and file of the Allies. The morale of the Allied forces plummeted, and it seemed as if nothing could stand in the way of the Axis juggernaut. Desperate to counteract the German advances, the United States began to invest heavily in research, hoping to develop a weapon capable of neutralizing the reptiloiden and piercing the Nebelkrieg. Time was of the essence, as every day brought the Germans closer to American shores. The potential use of Nebelkrieg on a larger scale raised concerns for the Allied forces, as they have yet to uncover the origins and workings of this deadly technology. The future of the conflict could be heavily influenced by the ability of the Allies to adapt and counter this new form of warfare. Germany's quest for world domination took a dark and treacherous turn as they betrayed their fellow Axis powers without warning. Believing the Axis alliance was no longer necessary for their ultimate goal, the Germans unleashed the full force of their Nebelkrieg and reptiloiden upon their former allies, showing no mercy and leaving a path of destruction in their wake. As the Germans expanded their territory, the battles fought in Europe became increasingly brutal. The fall of Rome marked a turning point in the conflict. The once great city was left in ruins, a testament to the ruthlessness of the German forces. The conquest of Italy sowed fear and panic throughout the remaining Axis powers, as it became clear that none were safe from Germany's ambitions. Before pivoting towards America, the Germans launched an all-out assault on Britain, intending to bring the island nation to its knees. Waves of bombers soared over the English Channel, dropping a relentless barrage of explosives and Nebelkrieg canisters. As the fog engulfed cities and the countryside alike, the reptiloiden swarmed through the haze, wreaking havoc and spreading terror. The Battle of London was particularly brutal. As the fog rolled in, the city's iconic landmarks were swallowed by the eerie mist, leaving Londoners feeling isolated and vulnerable. The British Royal Air Force fought valiantly against the German bombers, but their efforts were often thwarted by the disorienting fog. Despite their best efforts, the relentless bombing campaign left much of London in ruins. However, the resilience and determination of the British people could not be broken. Unwilling to submit to German rule, they banded together to form a fierce resistance movement. Utilizing their knowledge of the city's labyrinthine streets and underground tunnels, they launched daring guerrilla attacks against the German soldiers occupying their homeland. Across Europe, the tide began to turn as the various resistance movements, inspired by the British, coordinated their efforts and shared intelligence. The Germans, now stretched thin, found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, their once unstoppable momentum stalling. As the battles raged on in Europe, the bombing of Britain served as a stark reminder of the stakes at hand. The United States, witnessing the devastation and determined to prevent a similar fate, accelerated its research and military preparations. As the Germans turned their attention towards America, they found a formidable and determined foe, ready to defend their homeland and bring an end to the German conquest. The ensuing showdown between the two superpowers would determine the fate of the world, as the indomitable spirit of humanity faced its greatest challenge yet. With the United States on high alert, newspaper headlines of sightings of German U-boats lurking off the East Coast sent shockwaves through the nation. Major harbors, from Boston to Miami, were placed on high alert. The president, through a nationally broadcast radio address, enacted the draft, calling on all able-bodied men to serve in defense of their country. New York City, the symbolic heart of America, became a hub of military activity. Soldiers patrolled through the streets, their presence both a reassurance and a stark reminder of the looming threat. Anti-aircraft, AA batteries were hastily assembled on rooftops, in parks, and along the waterfront as the city braced itself for what could potentially be an imminent attack. With the city on high alert, the atmosphere was tense, and the once bustling metropolis felt eerily quiet. Streets that were normally filled with the sounds of laughter and lively conversation were now occupied by the low rumble of military vehicles and the distant echoes of drills and hammering. As the situation in Europe continued to deteriorate, communication with the continent became increasingly sporadic. The blackout of news from Europe only served to heighten the anxiety gripping the nation. For 2 long weeks, Americans were left in the dark, wondering what fate had befallen their allies across the Atlantic. During this time, American citizens banded together, supporting one another through the uncertainty. Rationing was introduced, and people were encouraged to grow their own food in victory gardens to aid the war effort. Families huddled around their radios, listening intently to the few news broadcasts that managed to break through the silence, desperate for any information about the conflict raging overseas. As the days dragged on, the sense of anticipation and dread grew stronger. The people knew that the Germans were coming, but they had no idea when or where they would strike. The American military was in a race against time to bolster its defenses and prepare for the inevitable confrontation as the shadow of war loomed ever closer. In this crucible of fear and determination, the United States found itself on the precipice of a great struggle, one that would test the resilience and courage of its people and determine the course of history. On the eve of December 7th, 1941, the day that the American public had been dreading finally arrived. News broke that the remaining European underground forces had fallen to the relentless Germans. The once indomitable British resistance, which had fought so bravely in the face of overwhelming odds, had finally succumbed to the combined might of the Nebelkrieg and the fearsome Reptiloiden. With Britain's surrender, the last European bastion of hope had been extinguished, and there was nothing left to halt the German advance across the Atlantic. This grim news sent shockwaves across the United States, the reality of the situation becoming terrifyingly clear. We are now the last line of defense against the encroaching German war machine. The urgency of the situation became palpable, and the nation redoubled its efforts to prepare for the impending invasion. The last wire that made its way out of the European allies to the United States was only two cryptic lines. Beware the fog. The Rippers are a half-finished warning, leaving only USF intelligence officers to speculate. The president addressed the nation in a somber speech, urging citizens to remain steadfast in the face of adversity. He called on every American to do their part in supporting the war effort, whether it be through volunteering, rationing, or offering moral support to the brave men and women in uniform. As the German forces began to mobilize for the transatlantic assault, the United States intensified its preparations. The military worked around the clock to strengthen the coastal defenses, deploying more AA batteries, constructing coastal fortifications, and mobilizing naval assets to patrol the waters surrounding the East Coast. In New York City, the sense of urgency reached a fever pitch. Evacuation plans were put into place, and citizens were instructed on what to do in case of an attack. Air raid sirens were tested, and blackout drills were conducted to ensure that the city would be shrouded in darkness, making it more difficult for German bombers to locate targets of importance or interest. As the German armada began its journey across the Atlantic, the American people braced themselves for the greatest battle their nation had ever faced. Determined to defend their homeland and preserve their way of life, they stood united, ready to confront the darkness that threatened to engulf the world. The stage was set for a monumental clash of wills as the fate of the free world hung in the balance. Reports of attacks along the west coast of California, along with the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, slammed the headlines of America. War had finally come to the shores of the U.S. 1 week later, along the East Coast, the day of reckoning finally arrived. Along with a naval blockade of U-boats and destroyers, the German Luftwaffe air forces arrived en masse along the East Coast, initiating their long-awaited assault on the United States. They began with a devastating barrage of Nebelkrieg and aerial bombardments up and down the East Coast, focusing primarily along Boston, MA, New York City, NY, and New Haven, CT. New York City, with its extensive preparations and bolstered defenses, managed to hold steady against the initial onslaught. However, the intensity of the attacks made it clear that the city was under imminent threat and would be unable to hold the attacks back indefinitely. Recognizing the danger to civilians, the U.S. Armed Forces issued an urgent order for the evacuation of all non-combat personnel, prioritizing the children and the elderly. The government worked tirelessly to coordinate a massive evacuation effort, utilizing rail and mass transit systems to transport vulnerable citizens to safe havens further inland. As the city's train stations and bus terminals filled with anxious evacuees, the military and civilian volunteers worked together to maintain order and ensure that everyone reached their designated transport. With each train and bus that departed, tearful goodbyes were exchanged as families were separated. This is where our story begins.